Evan Taylor woke up to a golden Saturday morning in early fall with a contented smile. Sunlight spilled through the bedroom curtains of his suburban Massachusetts home, casting warm stripes across the quilt that he and his wife Rachel had picked out together years ago. Evan turned his head on the pillow to see Rachel still peacefully asleep beside him, her dark hair fanned over the sheets and a gentle rise and fall of her chest with each breath. To him, it was the picture of a perfect life. Quietly, so as not to wake Rachel, Evan slipped out of bed. He pulled on a t-shirt and sweatpants and padded down the hall to check on their daughter, Ava. The 6-year-old was curled up amid a tangle of stuffed animals, her cheek resting on her favorite teddy bear. Evan felt a wave of warmth and protectiveness as he watched her sleep. This was his world, a loving wife, a bright and beautiful child, and a respected career. It all seemed almost too good to be true. Downstairs, Evan began their morning routine. He brewed fresh coffee, Rachel's favorite French roast, which filled the kitchen with a rich, welcoming aroma. As it percolated, he flipped pancakes on the stove, humming a little tune he'd made up just to coax Ava out of bed on weekends. Soon enough, the sound of small footsteps pattering on the hardwood floor announced Ava's arrival. "Daddy!" Ava yawned as she ran to him, wrapping her tiny arms around his legs. She was still in fuzzy pajamas, and her curly brown hair was an untamed halo around her face. Evan scooped her up effortlessly, planting a kiss on her forehead. "Good morning, sunshine," he said softly. "Ready for pancakes?" Ava nodded sleepily and laid her head on his shoulder. Holding her close, Evan carried her to the table. He glanced up to see Rachel coming down the stairs, tying the belt of her robe around her waist. Even in the simple robe, Rachel looked graceful. Her smile upon seeing them was radiant. For a moment, Evan's heart swelled with gratitude. He felt like the luckiest man alive. They sat together for breakfast like countless Saturdays before, laughter and light conversation filling the kitchen. Ava chattered about her friends in first grade and a drawing she had made of their family. Rachel teased Evan about an ink smudge on his cheek from falling asleep on his notes the night before. He was a tenured history professor at Boston College, and he had indeed spent a late night reviewing lecture materials. They both laughed as he tried to rub the spot off with a napkin. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss. They were a happy family enjoying a simple morning. Evan read a section of the newspaper while Rachel helped Ava cut her pancakes into bite-sized pieces. Rachel was affectionate, resting her hand on Evan's when he jokingly grumbled about a baseball score in the sports page. He responded with a wink and a squeeze of her fingers. If there were any storm clouds on the horizon of their marriage, Evan did not see them. After breakfast, Rachel offered to take Ava to the park so Evan could catch up on grading papers. It was a kind gesture, and Evan appreciated it. Mid-semester always left him buried in essays and exams to mark. "We'll have a girls' outing," Rachel said cheerfully as she cleared the plates. "You get some work done, and maybe later we can all see a movie." Evan agreed with a grateful smile. He kissed Ava's cheek, then gave Rachel a quick peck on the lips as she grabbed the car keys. "Have fun, you two. I'll join you later," he said. He watched from the doorway as Rachel secured Ava in her booster seat in the back of their SUV. Ava waved enthusiastically through the window as they backed out of the driveway. Evan waved back, still smiling as the car disappeared down the tree-lined street. With the house now quiet, Evan carried his coffee mug into his home office. The room was lined with overflowing bookshelves and framed diplomas, a peaceful sanctuary where he typically felt at ease. He sat at his desk, turned on his laptop, and prepared to immerse himself in grading. Outside, the late morning sun illuminated the fiery reds and golds of autumn leaves in their backyard. As he sipped his coffee and opened the first student essay, Evan's mind wandered contentedly. He reflected on how far he had come. At 40 years old, he had a fulfilling career teaching American history, a loving family, and even a friendly rivalry with a colleague that kept him sharp. Life wasn't just good. It was wonderful, comfortably settled into a pleasant rhythm. That thought was interrupted by the trill of his phone vibrating against the desk. Evan picked it up, expecting perhaps a reminder or a message from a student. Instead, he saw a notification that made his brow furrow. It was a cloud storage alert. Your file upload is complete. He hadn't uploaded any files that morning. Curious, he clicked the notification, which opened the cloud drive that both he and Rachel used for backing up photos from their phones. Perhaps Rachel had taken some new pictures at the park and they were auto-uploading, he thought with a fond smile. He navigated to the folder labeled Mobile Uploads, expecting to see new snapshots of Ava on the swings or petting a puppy at the park. What he found instead made his heart skip a beat. In the thumbnails loading before him were images that immediately struck him as odd. The first was a photo of a hotel conference room with a group of academics clustered near a projector screen. It looked like a snapshot from a conference banquet, something he often attended as a professor. But he didn't recall Rachel ever taking a photo like that. The next image was a candid shot of two people standing very close together in a dimly lit hallway, a man and a woman. Evan's pulse quickened as he recognized the man in the photo, Professor Colin Hartley. Even in the grainy quality, Colin's distinctive build and confident posture were evident. Hartley's arm was wrapped intimately around the waist of the woman beside him. The woman's face was half turned away, but she had Rachel's figure and the same chestnut brown hair color as his wife. Evan felt a chill creep up his spine. He clicked on the photo to enlarge it, his hand trembling. The full-size image loaded, and there was no mistaking it now. The woman was Rachel. She was dressed in an elegant navy blue evening dress, the same dress Rachel had bought for an academic gala last spring. In the photo, she was looking up at Colin Hartley with an expression Evan had never seen before, nervous, tender, and far too familiar for a woman who should have been nothing more than polite with her husband's colleague. Colin was leaning down, his lips barely inches from Rachel's, as if they'd been caught just before or after a kiss. Evan's breath left him in a ragged exhale. It felt as if the room had suddenly dropped 10 degrees. Why was Rachel in an intimate pose with Colin Hartley? Colin was a fellow professor in his department, and more notably, Evan's main academic rival. They had clashed for years over research accolades and departmental influence, but their rivalry had always remained professional, or so Evan had thought. Rachel knew Colin as an acquaintance through university events. She had chatted with him during faculty dinners, but never had Evan imagined seeing them like this. His heart thudding, Evan forced himself to look at the other photos that had uploaded. Another image showed Rachel and Colin sitting close together at what looked like a hotel bar, heads tilted toward each other, deep in conversation. Rachel's hand rested lightly on Colin's forearm. There was an undeniable intimacy in their body language. A third photo was a selfie Rachel had taken. Evan could see her face clearly now. She was smiling softly at the camera, and in the background, clearly on the same hotel bed behind her, was Colin, reading something on a laptop, oblivious to the photo being taken. Both were fully clothed, but the setting was unmistakably a hotel room, the kind one might share during an overnight conference trip. Evan's stomach churned with a nauseating mix of disbelief and dread. He felt like an outside observer watching someone else's life fall apart through the screen. As if on autopilot, he scrolled further. Among the photos were also screenshots of messages. He clicked on one image that was a captured text conversation. Rachel's name was at the top as the contact, but the messages weren't between her and him. They were between Rachel and a contact labeled CH, Colin Hartley. With a mounting sense of unreality, Evan read the most recent messages. Vabinet kopirovat redaktirovat CH. Can't wait until the conference next month. Just booked our room. Suite with a lake view as promised. Rachel, you spoil me. I'm excited too, counting down the days. CH, every moment with you is worth it. I hate keeping the secret, but I love you. Rachel, me too. I wish things were different, but thank you for understanding. CH, soon, maybe. Let's talk more in person. Evan's vision blurred at the edges as a wave of dizziness struck him. He set the phone down with a clatter on the desk, His hands clenched into fists. The words swam in his mind. Sweet with a lake view. I love you. Secret. There was no misinterpreting this. Rachel, his wife, the woman he thought he knew inside and out, was having an affair with Colin Hartley. The edges of his world trembled. Evan felt his chest tighten, each breath suddenly a conscious effort. How long had this been going on? How could he have missed the signs? A montage of memories flashed through his mind unbidden. Rachel attending a weekend girls' trip a few months back that coincided with a conference Colin had also attended. Rachel laughing at Colin's jokes at a department holiday party, while Evan rolled his eyes playfully, not seeing any danger. Late nights when Rachel claimed her book club ran long or she was visiting an old friend in town. Each recollection now twisted under the suspicion that they were lies, covering something sordid and painful. Evan stood up abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. He paced the small office, heart pounding in his ears. A nauseating mix of fury and anguish roiled inside him. His mind raced with denials, even as the evidence glowed from his phone screen. There must be an explanation. Maybe it's not what it looks like. But the pictures, the messages, they were damning. He thought of calling Rachel immediately, demanding an explanation through the phone. But a cold, rational part of his brain told him that wouldn't do. He needed to see her face to face, to hear her say it. Hear something, an admission, a denial, anything that could make sense of this nightmare. His fingers ran through his short brown hair, tugging slightly, as if pain could focus him through the storm of emotions. Evan forced himself to stop pacing and look at his desk, where his tidy morning had exploded into chaos with a single notification. The coffee mug lay on its side, its contents spilled across a stack of ungraded essays, dark liquid seeping into the pages. In his shock, he hadn't even noticed knocking it over. He took a deep breath and tried to steady his trembling hands. Rachel and Ava would be back from the park at any moment. The thought of seeing Rachel now, pretending nothing was wrong, was unbearable. Yet confronting her in front of their daughter was out of the question. Ava was innocent in this and far too young to understand any of it. Evan knew he had to hold himself together, at least until he and Rachel could talk in private. Quickly, Evan wiped up the spilled coffee with an old towel he kept in the office, though the papers were a lost cause. A part of his mind latched onto that mundane task, trying to cling to normalcy for just a few more minutes. He closed the cloud drive on his laptop, but not before ensuring those incriminating photos and screenshots were saved to a secure folder only he could access. He might need them as evidence, in case this becomes as bad as it looks, he thought grimly. Moments later, he heard the sound of the garage door opening and the car pulling in. Evan felt his heart slam against his ribcage. Keep it together, he told himself. Swallowing hard, he exited his office and forced a semblance of calm onto his face. Rachel's laughter floated from the mudroom as she helped Ava out of her sneakers. "We'll show Daddy the leaves we collected," she was saying cheerfully. When Evan appeared, Ava ran to him with a paper bag filled with red and orange leaves. "Daddy, look! We got so many pretty ones!" Ava exclaimed, hopping with excitement. She was blissfully unaware of the tumult inside her father at that moment. Evan bent down and gave her a hug, carefully keeping his eyes on his daughter, so Rachel wouldn't immediately see the anguish and anger brewing in them. "That's wonderful, sweetie," he managed to say softly. He took one of the crisp maple leaves from the bag and pretended to marvel at it, all the while feeling like he might either burst into tears or yell. He wasn't sure which urge was stronger. Rachel stepped in, carrying a couple of grocery bags along with her purse. "We stopped by the farmer's market after the park," she explained with an easy smile. "I got those muffins you love, from the bakery stall." She leaned forward and gave Evan a quick kiss on the cheek, a familiar gesture that felt utterly foreign now. Evan stiffened despite himself. Did she notice? Her eyes searched his face for a half second, but then Ava was tugging at her hand, clamoring to show off the leaves. "That's great, honey," he murmured, both to Rachel and Ava, though his voice sounded distant in his own ears. Part of Evan wanted to confront Rachel that very second, demand to know how she could act so normal, so loving, while hiding this betrayal. But Ava was literally between them, bouncing on her toes, and his paternal instinct overrode his anger for now. He would not shatter his daughter's day, her sense of security, by exploding in fury. Not yet. Instead, Evan forced himself to go through the motions of normalcy a little longer. He helped carry the groceries to the kitchen. Rachel chatted about how nice the park had been. Apparently, Ava befriended a golden retriever puppy there, and they had taken pictures. At the word pictures, Evan had to turn away and busy himself at the pantry, his jaw tightening. Everything okay? Rachel asked from behind him, a slight question in her tone. Maybe she had picked up on his unusual silence or the stiffness in his posture. Evan took a slow breath and turned to face her. He had to act like nothing was wrong, at least until Ava was out of earshot. Yeah, he lied softly, managing a faint smile. Just thinking about all the grading I still have to finish. The half-truth tasted bitter. He had never been a good liar, especially not to Rachel. Rachel gave him a sympathetic look. Don't worry, you'll get it done. Maybe tonight after Ava goes to bed, I can help by making some coffee or proofreading a bit for you. She reached out and squeezed his arm reassuringly. The gesture was so normal, so Rachel, that for an instant Evan questioned everything. Could the woman standing here in their bright kitchen, concerned about him, really be the same person who wrote those messages? The cognitive dissonance was agonizing. Thanks, he muttered, gently pulling away under the pretense of putting the muffins away. He heard Rachel guide Ava to the living room to set up the leaf display for him to see later. This was his chance. He needed a moment alone to fortify himself. Evan stepped into the downstairs bathroom and quietly shut the door. As soon as he was locked inside, his facade crumbled. He gripped the edge of the sink, arms trembling, and stared at his reflection in the mirror. His face looked back pale and drawn, eyes wide with hurt and confusion. "Keep it together! Keep it together!" he chanted internally. He splashed cold water on his face in an attempt to shock himself into steadiness. In that small moment, away from his family's view, Evan allowed a single tear to escape, rolling down his cheek. He wiped it away harshly. There would be time for tears later, but not now. Now he needed to decide how to confront this without blowing apart his daughter's world more than absolutely necessary. He inhaled deeply and straightened up. In the mirror, determination hardened his expression. He didn't know the full story yet, but the evidence was damning enough that Rachel had to come clean. The perfect illusion of their life had been shattered with a few photographs and texts, and nothing would ever be the same. Evan stepped out of the bathroom and rejoined his family, trying to smile at Ava's excited display of colorful leaves laid out on the coffee table. He praised her creativity and gave her a tight hug, holding on a little longer than usual as if for strength. Rachel watched them with a soft expression, perhaps reading it as a tender father-daughter moment. She had no idea that inside, Evan was bracing for the storm that was about to come. Chapter 2. Painful Realizations. That evening, once Ava was tucked into bed with her new leaf collage proudly taped to her wall, Evan knew it was time. The day that had begun in warmth and love had descended into a tense quiet. Rachel noticed Evan's unusual mood and had asked again during dinner if something was wrong. He had deflected, saying he was just tired. But now, with the house dark and silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator, he could delay no longer. Rachel was in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes from dinner. Her back was turned when Evan entered the room. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching the woman he had loved for over a decade, the mother of his child, and wondered how their lives had reached this breaking point. He cleared his throat softly, and Rachel glanced over her shoulder. She offered him a gentle smile. "Hey, I was just cleaning up. You heading to your office to do a bit more work?" Her voice was casual, but there was a hint of concern beneath. She could sense something off about him. even if she didn't know what. Evan's heart pounded. The confrontation he'd been dreading and rehearsing in his mind all afternoon was upon him. Actually, Rach, he began quietly, we need to talk. Something in his tone caused Rachel to turn off the faucet and face him fully, drying her hands on a dish towel. All right, she said slowly, concern now plain on her face. What's going on? Evan opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. His hands were trembling again. He realized he was still holding his phone, evidence in hand. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward her. The cloud drive folder with the damning photos was already open on the screen. Rachel looked down at the phone in confusion. Evan saw her eyes land on the first photo, the one of her and Colin in the hotel hallway, wrapped in each other's arms. In an instant, her face drained of color. The towel slipped from her fingers to the floor. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the kitchen clock ticking. Rachel's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. She swiped tremblingly through the images, seeing each photo and then the screenshots of the messages. Her hand flew to her mouth as a soft, involuntary "oh my God" escaped her. Evan felt a surge of anguish at her reaction. It confirmed everything. She wasn't denying it, wasn't confused about what those images were. She knew. The truth lay bare between them in the glow of the phone screen. How long? Evan managed to ask, his voice rough and low. He was afraid if he spoke any louder, it would crack with pain or rise with anger and alert their daughter asleep upstairs. How long have you been involved with Colin? Tears welled in Rachel's eyes, and she looked up at him with pure panic and regret. Evan, she choked on her words, shaking her head as if in disbelief. It's not. I can explain. Evan felt a bitter taste in his mouth. Explain then, he said, attempting to keep his tone calm, though an edge of hurt bled through. Explain to me what those photos mean, what those messages mean, because all I see is my wife in a hotel room with another man, with Colin, of all people. He nearly spat the name, anger flaring as he said it. Rachel stepped forward, reaching out as if to touch his arm, but Evan pulled back instinctively. The rejection made her face crumple. She quickly wiped at her tears. In a hushed, trembling voice, she began, It's not what you think. It's not about you or him, it's... She stopped, realizing how absurd that sounded given the evidence. I mean, it's not a typical affair. We didn't... She faltered. We didn't sleep together, Evan. I need you to believe that. It never went that far. Evan's eyes narrowed. His mind flashed to the photo of Colin on the hotel bed behind her in that selfie. It sure looked like they had shared that room. But still, a desperate part of him clung to the hope that maybe physical lines hadn't been crossed. You expect me to believe it never got physical? He asked, voice strained. Emotional or physical, Rachel? You betrayed me. You lied to me. Why? When did this start? Rachel swallowed hard, tears spilling down her cheeks now. She glanced anxiously toward the kitchen doorway, as if fearful that Ava might appear. It started after last year's faculty retreat, she said quietly, almost inaudible. At the Lake Conference Center in New Hampshire. We kissed. Just once. It started there. Evan's mind quickly recalled that retreat. He'd been there with both Rachel and Colin, along with other faculty. It had been a weekend of seminars and social events. He remembered one evening Rachel turned in early with a headache, and Colin had stayed at the lakeside bonfire with the others. Or so he'd thought. His stomach twisted, imagining that while he mingled by the water, his wife might have been somewhere with Colin, sharing that first forbidden kiss. Rachel saw the realization and pain in Evan's eyes and hurried on, words tumbling out. I didn't mean for it to happen. I was feeling lonely and he listened. We talked that night, just talked, and I was upset about us. Us? What about us? Evan interrupted, hurt flashing into anger. I thought we were fine. We were fine. Or so you let me believe. Rachel flinched at his tone and quickly hushed her voice further. Please, keep your voice down, she whispered urgently, eyes darting upward to the ceiling where Ava's room was. Evan bit down on his tongue. He hated that even in this moment he had to modulate his pain for their child's sake, but Ava's well-being came first. In a rapid, hushed tone, Rachel continued, That night I felt like you were drifting away from me. You were so busy with work, with trying to secure that research grant, remember? I felt invisible. Colin came out to check on me on the terrace. I was crying and embarrassed. He comforted me. We talked for hours. He understood what I was feeling. And then, he kissed me. I swore to myself it was a mistake and it would never happen again. Evan listened, jaw clenched tight. Every fiber of him wanted to lash out, to shout that her justifications meant nothing against the betrayal of trust. But he forced himself to keep calm enough to hear the rest, to piece together this ugly puzzle of why. Rachel wiped her eyes. After that, we didn't see each other for a while outside of work events. I avoided him. I felt so guilty, Evan. I hated myself for it. But at the same time, I was angry with you. Her voice cracked. Angry that I felt so lonely that I turned to someone else just for comfort. And I know that's my fault too. I should have talked to you instead. I know it. She covered her face with her hands for a moment, stifling a sob. Evan's hands tightened into fists on the counter. He remembered that period. Indeed, he had been very busy writing a grant proposal and prepping a new course. Perhaps he had neglected her feelings, but that hardly excused seeking solace in the arms of his rival. He kept his voice low but firm. So it was my fault. I made you do this? The bitterness in his whisper was palpable. Rachel dropped her hands. No, that's not what I'm saying. She sniffed and tried to steady her voice. I focused on our family after that. Things were okay for a few months, weren't they? Evan thought back to the holidays last year. Rachel had indeed been more attentive than ever, almost overly so. Now it made sense. She was overcompensating for her guilt. The realization was like swallowing broken glass. But then, during the spring conference season, our paths crossed again. Without you around, I let my guard down. We spent too much time together, and our connection rekindled. We kissed again, and from there it just kept going. I am so sorry, Evan, she said, voice breaking. We didn't sleep together. It never went that far, I promise. Evan wasn't sure what to believe anymore. He felt sick to his core. The image of them in that hotel room from the selfie suggested at least a deep level of comfort and likely physical intimacy. Perhaps she was telling the truth about not going all the way, but it hardly mattered at this point. A line had been crossed, many lines, repeatedly, and she had chosen to hide it from him for months. Why Colin? He asked, agonized. Anyone else, maybe I could understand better. But my own colleague, my rival? You knew how I felt about him. He's always been undermining me at work, always competing. Did that thrill him or something? That he could get to you behind my back? Rachel shook her head fiercely. It wasn't like that, at least not for me. It wasn't about him being your rival. He was just there when I was feeling abandoned. Her voice was laced with shame. I never meant to fall for him, Evan. I didn't even realize it was happening until I was in the middle of it. And now? What now? Evan asked, his tone hollow. Are you in love with him? Was he planning to take you on a romantic getaway? He gestured to the phone still on the counter, recalling the messages about the suite with a lake view. Rachel hesitated, guilt all over her face. He invited me to a conference next month in Vermont. We had planned that, yes, she admitted. The idea was to spend time together, away from everything. But Evan, I swear, I was so confused. I didn't know whether to go through with it or to break it off. I've been so racked with guilt. Every time I look at you and Ava, I feel horrible. But I felt trapped, like I didn't know how to stop without blowing up everything. She gave a bitter laugh that turned into a sob. Well, everything's blown up now anyway, isn't it? Evan ran a hand over his face. He hadn't moved from his spot, standing rigidly a few feet from her, as if any closer would hurt him physically. In truth, he felt like if he went any nearer or touched her, he might either collapse or do something rash. Despite the tempest inside him, he maintained control. You should have thought of that before, he said quietly. Before you let it get this far. Before you lied to me over and over. Rachel nodded, tears dripping off her chin. You're right. You're absolutely right. I have no excuse, no justification. I've been a terrible wife. I betrayed your trust. She took a shaky breath. It started as an emotional affair, I swear it. And in some twisted way, I told myself that was okay because I wasn't sleeping with him. But it isn't okay. Emotional or physical, it was a betrayal just the same. I felt so alone and unappreciated, and I made the worst mistake of my life trying to fill that void. Her admission hung in the air. Evan's eyes burned, but he refused to cry in front of her. We could have talked, Rachel, he whispered, voice trembling now despite his efforts. We could have gone to counseling, done something. I had no idea you felt that way. You never said anything that made me think. He broke off, realizing even as he said it how perhaps he had missed subtle signals. Late at night, her quiet sighs when he had to answer one more email. The way she sometimes asked if he could skip a conference and he insisted he couldn't. Hindsight showed him a dozen small red flags he had been too preoccupied to notice. We should have, she agreed sorrowfully. I should have. I was cowardly and selfish. Instead of confronting our issues, I escaped into a fantasy that only made things worse. Evan looked at the woman he had loved for so long, feeling like she was now a stranger. The trust that had been the foundation of their marriage was shattered. He didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. The perfect illusion of their happy home was gone, replaced by a raw and ugly reality. Rachel reached out slowly, eyes pleading, and this time Evan let her rest her hand lightly on his arm. Her touch was familiar and heartbreakingly painful. I am so sorry, Evan, she whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt Ava. I was going to end it, I swear. I was trying to figure out how. Evan closed his eyes at the mention of their daughter. What about Ava? He asked, his voice cracking now despite himself. Were you thinking of her at all while sneaking around with Colin? Did he mean more to you than your own family? Rachel's face contorted in grief. No, nothing means more to me than Ava and you, she said through a sob. That's the terrible part. I knew I was risking the two most important people in my life for something selfish and fleeting. I knew it, and I still did it. I was lost, Evan. I felt like I'd lost myself, and he made me feel seen, and. She stopped herself as Evan winced. It's not worth it. None of what I felt with him is worth what I've done to you. To us. There was a long silence. Evan opened his eyes and saw the truth of her remorse, but it did not diminish his pain. Love, anger, betrayal, so many conflicting emotions warred within him. He realized with a hollow pang that, despite everything, he still loved her. But that love was now irreversibly tainted by what she had done. It couldn't be the same. Finally, with a heaviness in his voice that spoke of defeat, Evan said, I think you should sleep in the guest room tonight. He couldn't bear the idea of sharing their bed, the bed where he had woken up so content just this morning, with her now. Rachel nodded, a fresh tear sliding down her face. I understand, she whispered. Of course, whatever you need. She looked like she wanted to say more, perhaps to beg for forgiveness right then. But instead, she turned slowly and walked toward the stairs, shoulders hunched. Evan remained in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles were white. He listened as Rachel quietly peeked in on Ava's room. He heard the faint creak of the door, then the soft click as she closed it, and then the sound of her footsteps going to the guest room at the end of the hall. A door closed gently. Only then did Evan allow himself to break down. In the emptiness of the kitchen, he sank into a chair and lowered his face into his hands. A silent, shuddering sob racked his body. The life he thought he knew had been upended in a single day. Images of Rachel and Colin together, the words of their texts, replayed mercilessly in his mind. The perfect illusion had been shattered, and the pain of its shards cut deeply into Evan's heart. He knew the road ahead was about to get unimaginably difficult. But even in his sorrow, a spark of resolve ignited within him. This betrayal would not destroy him completely. Somehow, someway, he would confront it, and them, on his own terms. For tonight, though, he could do nothing but silently grieve the death of the happy life he thought he had, as the autumn night settled coldly around the broken pieces of their family. Chapter 3. Falling Apart. The morning after Evan confronted Rachel felt like waking into a bad dream that refused to end. He had barely slept. When he did drift off in the early hours, he jolted awake imagining the empty space in the bed where Rachel should have been. In the gray light of dawn, Evan stared at the ceiling, reality crashing down anew. His wife had betrayed him, his marriage was in shambles, and the man at the center of it was the person he most despised. When he finally mustered the energy to rise, Evan found the guest room door closed and silent. Rachel must still be inside. It was Sunday, and Ava would soon wake up, expecting her usual family breakfast. Evan's heart clenched. What was he supposed to do? Pretend everything was normal for Ava's sake? The thought of a charade between him and Rachel, sitting at the same table after last night's revelations, felt like torture. As if on cue, he heard Ava's light footsteps padding out of her bedroom. Evan quickly wiped a hand over his face, trying to smooth away any trace of the sleepless night. He met his daughter in the hallway and forced a gentle smile. "Morning, pumpkin," he whispered, scooping her up before she could bound into the guest room, looking for her mother. Ava giggled, still groggy, and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Where's Mommy?" she mumbled. "She's sleeping in today," Evan lied softly, kissing Ava's hair. "How about we let her rest, and you and I make breakfast, just us two?" Ava nodded, satisfied with that plan. As he carried her downstairs, Evan's mind raced. He would have to talk to Rachel about how to handle things with Ava, but not now, not in front of their child. The priority this morning was shielding Ava from any sign that her world was crumbling. In the kitchen, Evan poured cereal for Ava and sat with her as she ate, the normalcy of the routine at odds with the turmoil in his chest. He managed to smile at her knock-knock jokes and answered her questions about whether they could visit the zoo next weekend. All the while, a heavy silence hung where Rachel's laughter and chatter should have been. It wasn't until almost mid-morning that Rachel emerged. Evan was cleaning up the dishes when he saw her standing hesitantly at the kitchen entrance. She looked pale and drawn, eyes swollen as if she'd been crying all night. She gave a tentative smile toward Ava, who was coloring at the table, then glanced uncertainly at Evan. "Good morning, sweetie," Rachel said to their daughter, her voice a fragile attempt at cheer. Ava ran over with one of her drawings. Rachel knelt to hug her, casting a quick, anxious look up at Evan. He offered no expression in return, focusing instead on wiping the counter, the tension in the room palpable. In a hushed tone, Rachel asked, "Did you and Daddy have breakfast already?" "Just cereal," Ava replied, oblivious to the strain between her parents. "Daddy said you were sleepy." Rachel managed a sad smile and kissed Ava's forehead. "I was, but I'm here now." She gently smoothed the little girl's hair. "How about you go pick out a dress to wear? We can go to the playground in a bit." Ava cheered and dashed off upstairs to her room. The moment she was out of earshot, an uncomfortable silence fell between Evan and Rachel. They stood several feet apart in the kitchen, as if an invisible chasm separated them. Rachel cleared her throat softly. "Thank you for taking care of her this morning," she said. Evan just nodded curtly. He hadn't spoken directly to Rachel since the confrontation. He didn't trust his voice to stay calm if he did. Rachel took a tentative step closer, lowering her voice. "We need to talk about what to tell her, Evan. She's going to sense something is wrong." Anger flickered in Evan's eyes, though he kept his tone low. "What do you suggest? That we lie to her? Pretend Mommy didn't destroy our family?" The bitterness was barely contained in his whisper. Rachel flinched. "Please, I know you're hurt. I am so sorry." She glanced toward the doorway to ensure Ava wasn't within earshot, then continued. "I think we should say nothing to her yet. Not until we figure out how we're going to proceed." "Proceed?" Evan repeated, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "You mean with us? With this marriage?" Rachel's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "After last night, I don't see how you could ever forgive me. Her voice caught. "Maybe it's best if I leave for a little while. Give you space." Evan felt both relief and panic at that suggestion. The thought of her leaving, taking Ava, even temporarily, cut him deeply. But the thought of living under the same roof pretending for Ava's sake was also unbearable. He rubbed a hand over his face, torn. "Where would you go?" he asked, struggling to keep his tone even. "I could take Ava and stay at my parents' house," Rachel offered. Her parents lived a couple of hours away in Connecticut. "Just for a week or two. She has cousins there. It might be a nice distraction for her. It will give you and me time to sort out what we want to do." Evan bristled at the idea of her taking Ava away, but maybe it was for the best in the short term, to shield their child from any fighting. "Fine, for a few days," he said stiffly. "But I want to see her. Don't you dare keep her from me." Rachel shook her head quickly. I swear, I wouldn't do that to you." "You can come down midweek or I can bring her back up to visit. Whatever you want, Evan." What he wanted was for this nightmare to not be real, but those wishes were futile. Instead, he just nodded. "We'll work out the details," he muttered, turning away to gather his keys and coat. I need to get out of here for a bit. Clear my head." In truth, he just couldn't stand the suffocating atmosphere another minute. Rachel's voice trembled. "Evan, please, don't shut me out of discussions. We need to figure out—" He cut her off, not in anger but in anguish. "Not now, Rachel. I can't." He left before his temper or heartbreak caused a scene in front of their daughter. The crisp autumn air outside did little to calm Evan's nerves as he walked aimlessly through the neighborhood. His mind replayed the confrontation with Rachel over and over. Part of him still struggled to accept that this was his life now, a marriage in tatters and a future uncertain. He felt hollowed out, alternating between fury at her and a deep sorrow for what Ava might endure. Evan realized he couldn't avoid his own home forever. After a long loop around the block, he returned. By then, Rachel had already begun packing some bags for herself and Ava. The sight of suitcases in their bedroom, half filled with Ava's clothes and favorite toys, nearly broke Evan again. He retreated to his study, unable to watch. Late that afternoon, he stood in the doorway as Rachel fastened Ava into the car seat. Their daughter was excitedly talking about a vacation at Grandma and Grandpa's. It pained Evan that Ava didn't understand this wasn't a happy trip. They had decided together, if one could call their stilted, forced exchange a decision, that they would frame it as a fun visit to her grandparents. There was no mention of separation or affair or any such ugly words. Rachel closed the car door and turned to Evan, tears in her eyes. "I'll call you tonight, so you can say goodnight to her. And we'll figure out a schedule. I promise I won't keep her from you." Evan gave a stiff nod, arms folded defensively across his chest. He felt numb. "Drive safe," was all he could manage to say, voice hollow. For a moment, it looked like Rachel wanted to hug him or at least touch his arm. But she stopped herself, knowing that comfort was neither welcome nor appropriate. Instead, she whispered, "I really am sorry," before walking around to the driver's side. Evan didn't respond. He watched as Rachel's car backed out of the driveway. Ava waved cheerfully through the window, and he forced a smile and wave in return until the car turned the corner and vanished from sight. The instant they were gone, Evan's knees nearly buckled. He sat down heavily on the porch steps, head in hands, trying to steady his breathing. The quiet of the house behind him felt like the echo of a life now lost. In less than 24 hours, he had gone from a happy husband and father to a man utterly alone. Over the next several days, life became a blur of pain and disorientation. Rachel stayed in Connecticut with Ava, as planned. True to her word, she let him video chat with their daughter each evening. Those calls simultaneously warmed and broke Evan's heart. Ava would excitedly tell him about playing with her cousins or making cookies with Grandma, and he would listen with a smile plastered on, reassuring her that he missed her and would see her soon. After each call ended, he sank back into misery, the empty house emphasizing how lonely he was without his little girl's laughter filling the rooms. On the work front, Evan took a personal leave for a week, citing a family emergency. He couldn't bear to stand in front of a lecture hall full of students or face his colleagues with his emotional turmoil so raw. Thankfully, the department dean was understanding about his need for a short break. At least that's what Evan thought at first. It wasn't long before whispers reached him even in his solitude. An old friend from grad school, now a professor at another university, texted to ask if he was all right. The friend had heard through the grapevine that Evan was taking time off due to a meltdown at home. The phrasing made Evan bristle with suspicion. He hadn't told anyone details beyond the emergency leave. How did rumors already start to circulate beyond campus? When Evan returned to the university the following week to resume teaching, he felt the change in atmosphere immediately. Colleagues who normally greeted him warmly in the faculty lounge offered only tight-lipped smiles or avoided eye contact altogether. Two professors he was friendly with exchanged a look when he entered the room, then abruptly left with their coffees. It was as though a dark cloud hung over him that others could see and were wary of. During a department meeting that Wednesday, the tension became tangible. Colin Hartley sat across the conference table, looking uncharacteristically stoic. Normally, Colin had a lot to say at these meetings, but he mostly watched, occasionally glancing at Evan with an unreadable expression. Evan did his best to ignore him, focusing on the agenda. But halfway through, the department chair cleared his throat and, with a grave expression, addressed Evan in front of everyone. "Evan, I need to mention, I received some concerning communications recently," the chair said. "It's about the research proposal you submitted last month. There are allegations." He paused, clearly uncomfortable, aware of all eyes now swinging between Evan and Colin. Evan's heart lurched. "Allegations?" he echoed. "What are you talking about?" The chair winced apologetically. "I'm sorry to bring this up here, but since the proposal review is a departmental matter, I think transparency is best. I received an anonymous email claiming that portions of your proposal's literature review were lifted from another scholar's work without proper citation." A shocked murmur went around the table. Evan felt as if he'd been punched. "That's ridiculous," he said immediately, heat rising to his face. "I wrote every word of that review myself. If some phrases resemble other work, it's incidental or common terminology. I absolutely did not plagiarize anything." He realized his voice was shaking with anger and humiliation. Plagiarism? The very idea was anathema to him. His record was spotless. Who would do this? His eyes involuntarily flickered to Colin. Colin was studying his own hands, feigning disinterest, but there was a slight curl at the corner of his mouth, almost a hint of satisfaction. The chair nodded quickly. I understand this is likely baseless, Evan, but the dean asked that we at least verify. It's probably just someone stirring trouble. If you could send me your notes and sources later, we'll put this to rest. Of course, Evan said, trying to rein in his emotion. I have nothing to hide. I'll provide all my references. His gaze stayed on Colin a beat too long. He could feel rage boiling in his chest. This had Colin's fingerprints all over it, he was certain. It was exactly the sort of subtle knife twist Colin would employ. A baseless accusation to tarnish Evan's reputation under the guise of due diligence. After the meeting, Evan managed to catch Colin in a deserted hallway. Through clenched teeth, he accused Colin of spreading lies and undermining him. Colin, ever smug, denied everything and insinuated that Evan was unraveling under pressure. Their exchange grew heated. Colin taunted him with a cruel remark about his personal issues and even hinted at consoling Rachel. In a flash of white-hot anger, Evan's fist slammed into the wall beside Colin's head rather than the man's face. Plaster cracked under the blow, and Colin flinched, momentarily startled. He recovered quickly, smoothing his jacket and flashing a poisonous smile. With a soft, menacing tone, Colin warned, "Careful, Evan. You wouldn't want to make things worse for yourself." Then he walked away, leaving Evan trembling with rage and resolve. In the days that followed, the plagiarism allegation was indeed found baseless. Evan submitted all his sources. A quick check by a faculty committee confirmed that any overlapping phrases were properly cited or coincidental. He was formally cleared, and the dean's office even offered a brief apology for the inconvenience. However, the damage to Evan's spirit was done. Some colleagues still eyed him with subtle doubt, as if wondering if maybe there was some truth, even if unproven. Mud, once flung, leaves a stain even when wiped off. Moreover, Colin's smear campaign didn't stop there. Evan caught wind that Colin had been hinting to people that Evan was going through a mental health crisis, and that perhaps the stress of work had been too much for him. One junior faculty member even gently asked Evan if he was feeling all right or needed any support, because Professor Hartley mentioned you'd been dealing with some personal difficulties. It was mortifying. Colin was spreading a narrative that painted Evan as unstable, which in academia could make others question collaborating with him or trusting him with responsibilities. Each day, Evan returned to an empty home, the silence a reminder of what else he'd lost. One evening, about 2 weeks after Rachel had left with Ava, a courier knocked on the door. Evan opened it to find a stern-looking man holding an envelope. "Evan Taylor?" the man asked. When Evan affirmed, the man handed over the envelope. "You've been served," he said flatly, then turned on his heel and left. Heart pounding, Evan closed the door and stared at the envelope in his hands. It was from a law firm. With dread, he tore it open and began reading the contents. It was a divorce petition filed in family court. Rachel was listed as the petitioner. Though he'd anticipated this might come, seeing it laid out in legal language twisted the knife even deeper. Rachel had formally filed for divorce. The petition cited irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. Massachusetts was a no-fault divorce state, so no specific wrongdoing was listed. Still, it felt like an unjust verdict on everything they had built together. He sank onto the couch as he read the details. Rachel was seeking primary physical custody of Ava, with reasonable visitation for him. She also sought child support and even alimony, citing that she had paused her career to support his and care for their child. Evan's hands shook with anger at some of the wording, clearly lawyer-crafted. Phrases implying he was often absent due to work commitments, and that Rachel had been the primary caretaker. It painted a picture of him as a distant husband and father, almost blaming him for the situation that she had created with her infidelity. A fresh surge of bitterness coursed through him. Was this Colin's influence too? The audacity of Rachel to demand money and custody after what she'd done made him furious. Perhaps she truly believed Ava was better off primarily with her. But from his view, this was yet another cruel consequence of her betrayal. She had shattered their family and now wanted to walk away with their daughter and his financial support, as if he were the sole cause of their breakup. Evan tossed the papers onto the coffee table, chest heaving. In all his life, he had never felt so wronged, so cornered. His marriage was over, his child's daily presence in his life threatened, and his career under siege by the very man who had precipitated it all. The thought made his blood boil and a sense of injustice burn within him. That night, he barely slept again. Instead, he found himself pacing the empty halls of the house, passing by framed family photos that now seemed like artifacts from another life. One showed him and Rachel laughing together on a beach vacation. Another had the three of them at Ava's 5th birthday, all smiles and joy. They mocked him now, these frozen moments of happiness, highlighting how far everything had fallen. For a brief, dark moment, Evan felt despair so profound it scared him. What if he just gave up? Let Rachel have what she wanted. Let Colin win whatever twisted game he was playing. He could quit his job, withdraw from the academic world that suddenly felt so cold and hostile, and start fresh somewhere far away from all of them. Maybe leave Boston altogether. But then his eyes rested on a photo of Ava, gap-toothed and beaming in her kindergarten class picture. That little girl was his anchor. No matter how painful this got, he couldn't abandon his daughter. She deserved better than that. And frankly, so did he. Why should he be the one to slink away in defeat? He had done nothing wrong. They had wronged him. In the stillness of midnight, a steely resolve coiled within Evan's chest. Yes, he was wounded, nearly broken. But he was not destroyed. Not yet. If Colin Hartley thought he could ruin Evan's life and get away with it, he was gravely mistaken. And if Rachel expected him to just quietly accept the terms of a divorce that punished him for her sins, she too would find he was not so easily cowed. He didn't have a concrete plan, not yet. But an idea had begun to take root in the back of his mind, sparked by the plagiarism accusation farce. Colin had tried to smear his name with a lie. What if there were truths about Colin that could be even more damning? Colin wasn't the paragon of virtue he pretended to be. Evan was sure of it. Academia was rife with egos and cutting corners. Who was to say Colin's record was as spotless as it claimed? Standing in his study late that night, Evan pulled out a box of old conference programs and university newsletters he kept in a cabinet. Paging through them, he found Colin's name appearing over and over. Speaking engagements, published papers, awards. Colin had always been ambitious, maybe even to the point of cutting ethical corners. Hadn't there been whispers years ago about similarities between one of Colin's books and another author's work? It was years ago and nothing came of it, but the memory surfaced now. As dawn neared, Evan sat at his desk, a determined look in his once tired eyes. If his enemies were going to bring the fight to him on every front, personal and professional, then he would quietly, carefully gather whatever ammunition he could to fight back. Not with fists, but with facts. The thought of exposing Colin for the fraud he might truly be gave Evan a grim sense of purpose. He realized with a clarity born of pain and anger that he was utterly alone in this battle. If he wanted justice, if he wanted to reclaim his life and protect what mattered, he couldn't rely on anyone else. He would have to be methodical and patient. He would have to strike back in a way Colin would never see coming until it was too late. On the messy coffee table, the divorce papers still lay open. They were a harsh reminder of what was at stake: Ava's future, his own reputation, the life he had built. Slowly, Evan picked them up and organized the pages. He would find a good lawyer and fight for his rights as a father. But legal battles could take time. In the meantime, he felt an overwhelming need to do something. Something that would prevent Colin from emerging victorious in this sordid affair. The world as Evan knew it was falling apart, but deep within the cracks of his broken heart and battered pride, a new resolve was hardening. If the traditional paths of fairness wouldn't protect him from liars and schemers, then he would have to seek his own form of justice. He would become, in his own quiet way, an instrument of retribution. And so, at Evan's lowest point, as the first light of dawn broke on another cold morning, he steeled himself with a whispered vow, "This isn't over." Chapter 4. Quiet Strategies. The days that followed were eerily quiet for Evan. With Rachel and Ava still staying at her parents' and only minimal contact aside from arranging visits, he had ample solitude. His lawyer, a sharp divorce attorney recommended by a colleague, assured him they would fight for fair custody and a reasonable settlement, especially given the circumstances of Rachel's infidelity. But even as legal proceedings inched forward, Evan's mind was consumed by another mission entirely. He spent his free hours in his study and at the university library, poring over old journals, conference proceedings, and any documents that bore Colin Hartley's name. He approached this task with the same rigor he used in historical research, but now the stakes were far more personal. Each morning he would wake up, remember the void in his life, and channel the pain into methodical investigation. If Colin wanted a war, then Evan would fight it on the battleground he knew best: research and truth. At first, it felt like searching for a needle in a haystack. Colin had a long list of publications, from journal articles to a well-reviewed history book. His academic career on paper was impressive and squeaky clean. Evan read through Colin's most cited works, looking for anything that raised a red flag. It was painstaking and often frustrating. By all appearances, Colin's writing was competent, even insightful in parts, though Evan bitterly wondered how much of those insights were truly his. Late one evening, Evan sat hunched over his desk, surrounded by printouts and books. The only light in the room came from a green-shaded desk lamp, casting a halo onto scattered papers. He rubbed his tired eyes and took a sip from a stale cup of coffee. So far, his scrutiny of Colin's recent works hadn't yielded much beyond a few passages that felt generic. If there were infractions, perhaps they lay deeper in the past. Setting aside the newer publications, Evan decided to examine Colin's earliest major works, especially those produced when he was under pressure to secure tenure. That was often a make-or-break period where some academics might cut corners. He remembered that nearly a decade ago, Colin had made waves with an article about early American trade routes, followed by his first book expanding on the topic. Those had propelled Colin's rise in the history field. Evan dug out a copy of that first book, Merchants of the New World, from the University Library archives. He also retrieved Colin's PhD dissertation, available through a digital repository. If Colin had been sloppy or unethical anywhere, it might be traceable in these formative works. As he delved into Merchants of the New World, a sense of DJ? View nagged at him. Certain passages rang a bell, not because they were famous, but because Evan felt he'd read something very similar during his own graduate studies. It was in the discussion about trade statistics between colonial ports. Evan recalled an old monograph by an obscure economic historian named Dr. Alan Westbrook that covered similar ground. After some digging, Evan found a reference to Westbrook's monograph in an online database. The monograph, published 25 years ago, wasn't widely cited, possibly because Dr. Westbrook had died shortly after publishing it, and his work didn't gain much traction. Evan requested an interlibrary loan for the text, which meant waiting a few days. Impatient, he scoured for excerpts or reviews of Westbrook's work. He found a scant few references, but one included a brief quote. Reading that quote, Evan's pulse quickened. It was virtually identical to a sentence in Colin's book, with only a few words altered. That could be coincidence. Historians often describe data in similar language, but Evan jotted it down as a lead. He needed the full text to compare. In the meantime, he turned to Colin's dissertation, hoping it might reveal a pattern of borrowing or lazy citation. Partway through the literature review chapter, Evan's eyebrows shot up. Colin had summarized prior work on trade routes, including a thesis by a researcher named Linda Park from a university in California. Evan had never heard of Park, which wasn't surprising. Her work was likely only known to a niche group. Colin's dissertation cited her once, briefly, but the summary of her findings seemed unusually detailed, almost as if he had lifted lines from her thesis verbatim. Evan hunted for Park's thesis. After some sleuthing, he managed to track down an old PDF scan in the archives of the California University's library. When he cross-referenced it with Collins' dissertation, his stomach tightened. Several sentences in Collins' literature review were, indeed, nearly word for word from Park's work. He had given her a citation in one spot, but the phrasing was uncannily similar, beyond what would be expected even when summarizing. In isolation, that might be brushed off as sloppy citation or too close paraphrasing by a grad student. It likely hadn't been caught by his dissertation committee, or they didn't care. But to Evan, this was a crack in the facade. By the time the Westbrook monograph arrived, Evan's desk was cluttered with annotated printouts. He eagerly flipped to the chapters on colonial trade data. There it was. Multiple paragraphs in Westbrook's measured academic tone discussing trade volume figures, which Collins' book echoed with only minor rewording. Collin had cited Westbrook generally in the bibliography, but in passages where the language mirrored Westbrook's, he hadn't used quotation marks or specific attributions. It was subtle, the kind of thing only someone familiar with both texts would catch. But it was plagiarism, plain and simple. Collin had presented Westbrook's analysis almost verbatim, as if it were his own interpretation. Evan felt a grim vindication. Here was proof that Collins' ethical lapses went beyond his personal life and seeped into his scholarship. And not just a one-time slip. Patterns were emerging. Emboldened, Evan continued digging. Over the next week, he uncovered more. In one of Collins' well-known journal articles on shipping ledgers, Evan found entire sentences that originally appeared in an earlier conference paper by a junior researcher. It turned out Collin had attended that conference and even asked the researcher questions he apparently parlayed into incorporating the other person's analysis into his own later article without credit. That junior researcher had since left academia. Their work had been quietly cannibalized, and they likely never knew. The most damning discovery came when Evan decided to reach out to an old acquaintance, Professor Emily Zhao, a historian in New York. Emily was known for her work on colonial trade as well, and years ago, Evan remembered her lamenting that some of her unpublished research ideas were scooped by others. They hadn't spoken in some time, but Evan mustered the will to call her under the pretext of catching up and consulting on a research question. Over a phone call, he carefully steered the conversation toward Collins' book. "Have you ever read Merchants of the New World?" he asked casually. Emily snorted. "Unfortunately, yes. Why do you ask?" Evan's heart quickened. "Did you notice anything familiar in it?" There was a brief pause, then Emily responded with a mix of bitterness and relief, as though grateful someone finally asked. "Familiar? You could say that. I swear Collin lifted a couple of case studies straight out of my doctoral dissertation. I mean, he tweaked names and data representation, but the narrative was mine. I was a fool. I shared some unpublished material with him at a workshop once, back when I was a grad student, and he was newly appointed faculty. He was friendly, gave me good feedback, or so I thought. 2 years later, I see portions of my work echoed in his book without so much as a nod to me. At the time, I was too intimidated to raise a fuss. He was rising in the field. I was nobody." Her voice had a sting of long-held frustration. Evan closed his eyes, anger swirling for Emily's sake and his own. "Why didn't you ever speak up or file a complaint?" She sighed. "It's hard to prove, and by the time I realized it, I'd have looked petty accusing him of stealing ideas. He could claim it was independent work. There were enough differences that it wasn't outright copy-paste, except maybe a few sentences. I moved on. I had to. But it soured me. I've kept my distance from him since, and frankly, I don't share my research in progress freely anymore." "I'm sorry that happened," Evan said quietly. "Hypothetically, if evidence of a pattern came to light now, would you be willing to support it? Maybe even testify or sign a statement about what occurred?" Emily was silent for a moment. "Is someone investigating him?" she asked. Evan chose his words carefully. "Let's say I have reason to believe your experience wasn't isolated. If one were to compile multiple instances of this kind of behavior, the university would have to take it seriously. A half-amused breath came from Emily. Evan, are you planning something? You sound awfully interested in taking Colin down a peg. He replied evenly, I believe in academic integrity, and I hate seeing good scholars like you get sidelined by unethical ones. Her tone warmed. Well, if there's a genuine inquiry, yes, I'd tell the truth about what happened. I kept all my drafts and emails just in case. I doubt I'm the only one he's done this to. After he hung up, Evan sat back, heart pounding not with fear, but with purpose and momentum. He had gathered a trove of evidence, side-by-side comparisons of Colin's writings with earlier sources that he plagiarized or closely paraphrased without credit. He had testimonies, or at least informal statements, from other academics like Emily who were willing to vouch for Colin's unethical appropriation of their work. With each new piece of evidence, Evan cataloged it meticulously in a dossier. Late one night, he laid everything out on his kitchen table. Photocopies of Colin's book pages highlighted in one color, Westbrook's monograph pages highlighted in another, where they matched. Printouts of Colin's article paragraphs side by side with the junior researcher's conference paper, with identical phrases circled. Excerpts of his dissertation and Park's thesis for comparison. It was damning. Looking at the spread of documents, Evan felt a cold resolve. This was how he would exact revenge. By the book, quite literally. No confrontations or melodrama, just the stark, indisputable truth that Colin Hartley was a fraud. The same academic world that Colin had climbed by deceit would now be the instrument of his downfall. Still, caution was paramount. Evan knew he had to remain anonymous in this. If it was obvious the complaint came from him, it might be seen as a personal vendetta. Colin could try to spin it that way, muddying the waters. No, the information had to surface in a way that looked like an independent discovery. Perhaps an anonymous tip to multiple places. The university's Office of Research Integrity, the journals that published his articles, even an academic blog or two that delighted in exposing misconduct. Anonymity had its risks too. Sometimes institutions ignored anonymous tips unless they were very specific and backed by evidence. Fortunately, Evan had amassed plenty of evidence. He went over his plan again and again. He decided the first salvo would be official, a carefully crafted anonymous packet to the university's Office of Research Integrity, ORI. He would include copies of the most blatant examples of plagiarism, complete with citations and comparisons. He would also drop hints that more could be found, encouraging a thorough investigation. On a cold Monday morning, Evan visited a print shop 2 towns over, paying in cash to make clean, professional copies of the dossier materials without using the university copiers, which might be monitored, or his home printer, which could potentially be traced. He then purchased a manila envelope and gathered the copied pages inside, along with an unsigned cover letter typed on a public library computer to avoid digital traces. The letter was succinct and formal. To the Office of Research Integrity. It has come to my attention that Professor Colin Hartley of the History Department may have committed academic misconduct, specifically plagiarism, in several of his works. I am providing a summary of evidence comparing Professor Hartley's publications to earlier works by other scholars. In his book, Merchants of the New World Year, multiple passages, see highlighted excerpts, closely match text from Dr. Alan Westbrook's monograph, Year, without proper quotation or citation. In his article, Commerce and Conflict, Journal Year, the analysis on pages XY mirrors work presented by Name at Conference Year, which Professor Hartley attended, with insufficient credit given. In his doctoral dissertation, Year, sections of the Literature Review, CPX, appear to be lifted nearly verbatim from author thesis Year. These examples suggest a pattern of misappropriation of others' intellectual work. I urge the office to investigate these and potentially other instances. Academic integrity is paramount, and such allegations, if proven, betray the trust of the scholarly community. Sincerely, a concerned academic, name withheld for protection. Evan read and reread the letter before printing it. It struck the tone he wanted, serious and factual, without hyperbole or personal grudge evident. By stating, name withheld for protection, he hoped to acknowledge why it was anonymous in a way that didn't diminish the credibility of the claims. That afternoon, he drove to a post office in a neighboring city and mailed the packet via certified mail, sans return address. Watching the mail clerk stamp it and toss it into the outgoing bin, Evan felt a mixture of anxiety and grim satisfaction. The fuse had been lit. For good measure, he also compiled a digital folder of the evidence and used a newly created throwaway email account to send a similar message to the editors of the journal where Colin's article had appeared, as well as to an academic watchdog blog known for reporting on misconduct cases. He used a public Wi-Fi connection at a coffee shop for these actions, ensuring they couldn't be easily traced back to him. By the time he returned home that evening, a light snow was falling, dusting the quiet street. Evan sat in his car for a moment, realizing that for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel completely helpless. He had been methodical and patient, and now he had launched a strike that could truly hurt Colin where it mattered most: his career and reputation. There was, of course, no immediate visible change. The world looked the same as it had the day before. Colin would still be obliviously going about his life, unaware of the storm gathering. The ORI would take some time to process the complaint. But the wheels were set in motion, quietly and without fanfare. Evan stepped into his house, alone with his thoughts. On the wall, an old framed poster caught his eye, an inspirational message he'd bought long ago. It read, "Truth is the daughter of time." He had always liked that quote as a historian, believing that with patience, the truth in historical research eventually emerges. Now, it resonated in a new way. He allowed himself a thin, resolute smile. The truth about Colin would come out, and when it did, it would be more devastating than any punch or shouted accusation could ever be. Quietly, in the silence of his living room, Evan raised a glass of water in a solitary toast. To truth, to justice served in due time, and to the quiet strategy of a man who had been underestimated. It was only a matter of waiting now. Chapter 5. The Academic Fallout. For a few weeks, nothing visibly changed on campus. Evan went about his duties, teaching classes and tending to his research as best he could while awaiting the outcome of the seeds he had sown. He kept a low profile, interacting politely with colleagues and scrupulously avoiding any unnecessary contact with Colin. If anyone noticed that Evan's demeanor was a bit more composed, more focused than his recent grief-stricken state, they likely attributed it to time-healing wounds or the progress of his divorce proceedings. Then, early one December morning, the storm broke. It began quietly enough. A meeting notice slipped under Colin Hartley's office door, summoning him to an administrative hearing regarding an academic matter. The Office of Research Integrity had acted on the anonymous packet. By protocol, they didn't reveal the accuser, only the allegations and evidence. Colin, who had grown complacent after weeks with no obvious retaliation from Evan, was caught off guard. According to whispers that soon spread, Colin arrived at the ORI meeting looking perplexed, but left looking furious and pale. By midday, an email circulated to certain faculty, those whose work was cited in the allegations, as well as department heads, requesting information about any knowledge they had of overlaps between Colin's publications and other works. The investigation had formally begun, and it wasn't going to stay secret for long. Evan learned of these developments indirectly. A sympathetic colleague from a different department, who knew nothing of Evan's personal involvement, mentioned over coffee, "Did you hear? They're investigating Hartley for plagiarism. The ORI is all over it. Rumor has it a pretty damning anonymous complaint came in with evidence." Evan feigned mild surprise. "Really? Wow, that's serious. Plagiarism, huh? I hadn't heard." He sipped his coffee to hide any betraying twitch of satisfaction on his lips. Inside, he felt a cold thrill. It was happening. The university had strict procedures for such investigations. A committee would review the materials, allow Colin a chance to respond, and potentially interview involved parties or outside experts. Colin, apparently, was vehemently denying wrongdoing, but the evidence presented was hard to refute. In the days that followed, tension on campus mounted. Those in the know spoke in hushed tones about shocking similarities and clear-cut cases of copied material. A few graduate students in the history program got wind and began gossiping that Professor Hartley was in big trouble. One even mentioned on social media, vaguely at first, that a certain prof is about to get Historian of Shame award for copy-pasting. It didn't take long for guesses and checks to narrow that certain prof to Colin. It didn't stay private for long. An academic watchdog blog caught wind of the allegations and published a scathing expose. Facing public scrutiny, the university was forced to confirm that an investigation was underway, though no names were officially named yet. Colin, meanwhile, was unraveling. On the second week of the investigation, he stormed into a brief faculty meeting looking unshaven and tense, a stark change from his usual composed self. Only a handful of professors were present. Others had avoided the meeting out of discomfort. Colin slammed a stack of papers onto the table, printouts of the blog post, and perhaps other documents. "This is a witch hunt," he snarled without preamble. The few faculty in the room, including Evan, froze. The department chair tried to calm him down. "Colin, maybe we should discuss this in private." "No, let's discuss it now," Colin snapped, eyes nearly wild. "Anonymous accusations? Really? And everyone just believes it?" His bloodshot gaze swung around the room, daring anyone to challenge him. When those eyes met Evan's, they blazed with open hostility. Evan met his gaze evenly, heart thumping but face calm. He could guess what was coming. Colin jabbed a finger at the papers, glaring at the chair and the handful of colleagues. "My name is being dragged through the mud publicly, and I'll tell you why. Because someone here has a vendetta against me. Someone here is trying to settle a personal score by ruining my career." A heavy silence followed. The chair cleared his throat, cautious. "Colin, the evidence, if true, is serious. The committee is doing its job impartially." "Impartial?" Colin barked a harsh laugh. "Do you even know how this started? Who sent that damned packet? It's Evan." He practically spat the name and pointed across the table at Evan. Evan felt a jolt as all eyes turned to him. He forced an expression of startled bewilderment. "Me?" he said, tone incredulous. "Colin, I have no idea what you're talking about." "The hell you don't!" Colin growled. He was losing composure by the second. "Who else would dig up decades-old research to fabricate a case against me? This is personal. It's because of—" He hesitated, realizing he was on the brink of airing extremely dirty laundry. His face twisted, but anger overrode caution. "It's because I was involved with Rachel. He's doing this to get back at me for that." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The chair's eyes widened in shock. One of the senior professors murmured, "Oh my goodness," under her breath. Everyone knew Rachel was Evan's wife, or soon-to-be ex. Now the affair that had been private was starkly laid out. Evan felt heat in his cheeks but maintained a calm tone. He leaned forward, folding his hands. "Colin, listen to yourself. You're claiming I engineered an entire plagiarism investigation because of a personal issue? That I somehow made up all those texts and comparisons that look just like yours and other people's work?" He shook his head, attempting to appear as baffled as anyone. "I get that you're upset, but you're grasping at straws. My marital issues have nothing to do with an academic inquiry. And frankly, bringing my wife into this, my daughter's mother, is beyond inappropriate." The chair found his voice, stern now. "Colin, that's enough. These allegations about your personal life have no bearing here, and accusing a colleague without proof is out of line. The investigation is being handled by ORI, not by individual faculty." Colin looked momentarily uncertain, realizing he'd overplayed his hand. But he doubled down, fists clenched on the table. "Don't be naive," he hissed. "You think it's a coincidence? He had motive to try to destroy me, and conveniently an anonymous packet appears accusing me of things nobody's ever complained about before. It's obvious this is a targeted hit." Evan held up his hands. "I wasn't even aware of the details of the complaint until they started to circulate," he lied calmly. "Believe what you want, but I've been trying to keep my life together these past weeks, not tear someone else's apart. I wouldn't jeopardize my own career by faking something like this. If the evidence is strong, that's on you, not me." Another professor nodded at this, and the chair added quietly, "The evidence is being vetted by independent experts, Colin. If it holds, no amount of conspiracy theorizing about who sent it will matter." Colin looked around at faces now filled with shock and discomfort. He realized he'd just revealed his affair to peers who had not known, further damaging his own standing. He was breathing fast, cornered. Without another word, Colin snatched up his papers and stalked out of the room, slamming the door behind him so hard a framed diploma on the wall rattled. No one moved or spoke for a long moment after he left. Evan exhaled slowly, as if calming himself. Inside, he felt a swirl of emotions, a degree of triumph that Colin was cracking in public, also a hint of anxiety now that the affair was out among colleagues. Mostly, he felt an icy satisfaction. Colin had unwittingly accelerated his own downfall. By trying to accuse Evan openly, he'd only managed to broadcast his own misconduct, both personal and professional, to a wider audience. The department chair ended the meeting shortly after, citing that the atmosphere was too charged to continue regular business. As they filed out, the senior professor gave Evan a sympathetic pat on the arm. "I'm sorry you had to hear that nonsense," she said gently. "This must be hard, all of it." Evan nodded somberly, playing the role of wronged husband to perfection. "It's been difficult," he replied. "I appreciate the support." In the hall, a couple of grad students who had likely heard the shouting peeked around a corner. Their eyes followed Colin's retreating form as he marched across the quad, phone to his ear, perhaps calling a lawyer or a sympathetic ear. By the end of that week, things moved swiftly. The ORI committee, perhaps expedited by the growing public attention, released preliminary findings to the university administration. The evidence was clear. Multiple instances of plagiarism were identified in Professor Hartley's work. They recommended immediate administrative leave pending a final report. The provost's office sent out a confidential memo, which inevitably leaked, stating that Professor Colin Hartley was being placed on leave and barred from campus during the investigation. His classes were assigned to other faculty for the rest of the semester. Students started whispering that he'd been fired for cheating or something. In the age of social media, the nuance between an ongoing investigation and a firing was lost. In their eyes, he was already guilty and gone. A second blog post appeared, this time naming Colin outright since the information was effectively public. It recounted the allegations in detail and noted his leave status. It also not so subtly referenced personal drama entangled with the academic misconduct, hinting at the affair. While not naming Rachel, it referred to a faculty spouse being involved, enough for many to figure it out. Rachel, who had largely been absent from campus life after leaving with Ava, suddenly found her phone inundated with messages. Friends and even a couple of nosy acquaintances reached out either fishing for details or offering awkward sympathy now that her affair was indirectly out in the open. It was a foretaste of the humiliation awaiting her, though Evan would only learn the extent later. As for Colin, his fall was precipitous. There was talk that the university was moving to convene a formal misconduct hearing, a step that usually precedes revocation of tenure and termination. Facing almost certain disgrace, Colin preemptively tendered his resignation before they could formally fire him, likely at the advice of an attorney who suggested it might preserve some chance of working elsewhere. But the resignation did little to save face. The story was out. and any institution that looked into his background would see the tarnish. One crisp afternoon, Evan passed by the history building and saw a scene that gave him pause. Colin, standing outside his office with cardboard boxes at his feet, shoving books and personal items into them. A security guard hovered nearby to ensure he complied with the leave terms without incident. Colin's face was a mask of anger and humiliation. This was the once confident professor who had seemed untouchable. Now he looked small and defeated. Evan lingered just out of sight, partially concealed by a pillar of the colonnade. He didn't want to gloat openly, but he allowed himself a brief moment to drink in the tableau. Colin abruptly dropped a heavy book into one box with a thud that echoed in the quiet corridor, then let out a curse as something, perhaps a framed photo, broke inside. The guard gave a perfunctory, unsympathetic warning to be careful. For a fleeting second, Colin looked up and around, as if sensing he was being watched. Evan stepped back, ensuring he was hidden. His heart was pounding, and he realized it wasn't purely joy at seeing his foe brought low. There was a complicated mix of emotions. Satisfaction, certainly, but also a grim realization that everyone involved was hurt now. True, Colin had brought it on himself, but watching a man lose everything, his career, his credibility, was sobering. Evan reminded himself that this needed to happen. Some might say he'd gone too far, but in truth, he had simply held Colin accountable to standards that should have been upheld anyway. If not him, someone else might have eventually uncovered Colin's fraud. He had just hastened the inevitable and tied it up in a bow. Over the next few days, the fallout continued. Colin's resignation was officially announced internally, citing personal reasons, a euphemism no one believed. There was talk of journals issuing retractions of his articles. The publisher of his book released a statement that they would investigate the allegations and consider pulling the title or issuing corrections. Students organized a forum on academic integrity, indirectly a chance to vent their disappointment that a professor they looked up to turned out to be a cheat. Faculty had to do damage control, reassuring students that this was an anomaly and not reflective of scholarly practice as a whole. Through it all, Evan remained outwardly detached from the chaos. He did his work diligently, meeting classes, grading finals, offering support to students who asked awkward questions like, "Did you know Professor Hartley was doing that stuff?" He simply answered, "I was as surprised as you. It's very unfortunate." Inside, however, he was filled with quiet vindication. The man who had nearly destroyed Evan's life was now himself ruined. And hardly anyone knew that behind the scenes, it was Evan's careful hand that had orchestrated the unraveling. Well, almost no one. There was one person who almost certainly knew the truth. Rachel. Although they were barely speaking except to coordinate Ava's schedule, Rachel was smart enough to put two and two together. Evan could imagine her reaction as news of Colin's plagiarism scandal hit her. Perhaps shock and denial that the man she'd been involved with was capable of such academic deceit. Then, maybe realization dawning, that Evan, with his research acumen and motive, could have been the catalyst. He had told her once in the heat of anger that her betrayal would not destroy him. Perhaps now she understood what he meant. Evan wouldn't find out her exact thoughts until later, but he knew Rachel well. She would feel the ripples of this catastrophe keenly, not only for what it revealed about Colin, but for what it said about her own choices. For now, as the final remnants of Colin's career crumbled, Evan prepared for the next chapter of his life. He had fought back against those who hurt him and had emerged, if not unscathed, at least victorious on his own terms. Colin Hartley was disgraced and gone, and the path was finally clear for Evan to rebuild from the ashes. Chapter 6. Shifting Tides. News of Colin's scandal did more than just remove a deceitful professor from his post. It cast long shadows over everyone associated with him. And no one felt that shadow more personally than Rachel. In the immediate aftermath of Colin's public disgrace, Rachel found herself swept into a storm of gossip and shame. The affair, which had once been a secret whispered in guilt, was now effectively public knowledge thanks to Colin's outburst, and the subsequent rumor mill. Rachel's phone buzzed incessantly with texts and voicemails. Some were from close friends, shocked and seeking the truth. Others from more distant acquaintances, masks of concern barely hiding their curiosity. Even her parents, who until then only knew she was having marital troubles, called in distress after a neighbor mentioned hearing that Rachel had run off with some professor who turned out to be a fraud. Rachel was mortified. She avoided social media entirely, but that didn't stop bits of the story from reaching nearly everyone in her orbit. She was now the woman who left her husband for a plagiarist, a scandalous bullet point that traveled quickly through academic circles and beyond. But beyond public humiliation was her private reckoning. The very qualities that had drawn her to Colin, his confidence, his professional acclaim, the way he had seemingly understood her, were all revealed to be part of a facade. The man she had risked everything for was not only ethically bankrupt, but he had shown an ugliness and crisis that she couldn't ignore. When the plagiarism allegations went public, Colin did attempt to contact Rachel, but those conversations were short and painful. At first, he ranted about being sabotaged and insisted Evan was behind it. He even had the gall to suggest that Rachel speak on his behalf, maybe tell people how brilliant he was. Later, as things deteriorated, his calls turned bitter. He indirectly blamed her for what was happening, as if their relationship had given Evan motive. In their final exchange, when she confronted him point blank about the evidence that he had plagiarized, Colin's tone turned ugly. He swore at her, accusing her of not standing by him. That was the end. Rachel cut off all contact with Colin Hartley, her illusion of him shattered beyond repair. One chilly evening a short time later, Rachel found herself parked outside the home she used to share with Evan and Ava. She had driven back from her parents' place specifically to talk to Evan. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as she gathered her courage. Ava was not with her tonight. Rachel had left her with her grandparents, knowing this conversation might be emotional and not wanting her daughter to witness more turmoil. Yellow light glowed in the living room window. This house, which she had once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like foreign territory. Rachel drew a shaky breath and stepped out of the car. She walked up to the front door and hesitated, heart pounding. Would he even let her in? He had every right to slam the door in her face. Still, she had to try. She rang the doorbell. A familiar chime echoed inside. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the door opened. Evan stood there, illuminated by the foyer light. He looked at her in mild surprise, clearly not expecting visitors. It struck Rachel how much had changed in a few short months. Evan seemed older somehow. There was a new seriousness to his face, a confidence edged with hardness. Yet when his eyes met hers, she also saw concern, or at least civility. "Rachel," he said quietly, "is everything all right? Where's Ava?" "She's with my parents tonight," Rachel replied softly. I came to talk, if you're willing." Evan regarded her for a moment, then nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." She entered, nerves taut. The warmth of the house and the familiar scent, clean laundry and a hint of the pine cleaner he used, made her chest ache with nostalgia. She noticed some changes. A few family photos were missing from the walls, likely taken down during the painful early separation. The space felt emptier. They moved to the living room out of habit. Rachel remembered countless nights curled on the sofa with him, watching TV or reading across from each other. Now they sat on opposite ends of that same couch like polite strangers. Evan broke the silence. "What did you want to talk about?" Rachel had rehearsed this on the drive, but now, face to face with Evan, words faltered. She looked down at her hands and mustered her courage. "First, I want to ask how you are. How you're coping." Evan tilted his head slightly, as if the question surprised him. "I'm all right," he said after a pause. "Better, I think. Things have been settling down." He offered no detail, his tone cautious. Rachel nodded, wringing her fingers. "I've heard about the new job offer. Columbia, right? Congratulations, that's a big deal. Her voice was earnest. In the weeks since Colin's fall, word reached her that a prestigious university, indeed Columbia in New York, had headhunted Evan, impressed by his work, and perhaps by the integrity he'd shown in navigating the recent ordeal with quiet dignity. The irony that Colin's scandal might have indirectly shone a light on Evan's principled character was not lost on her. Thank you, Evan said quietly. I haven't officially accepted yet, but yes, it's on the table. Another silence stretched. Rachel swallowed. Evan, I owe you an apology. Another one. A million of them, really. She met his eyes, which remained steady and listening. I'm so profoundly sorry for everything I did to you, to our family, and I'm sorry for even entertaining what Colin said about you being behind his downfall. For a second I thought, but then I realized how absurd that was. You wouldn't fabricate evidence, and even if you were involved in bringing the truth to light, it only proved he was exactly the kind of man I failed to see. She took a deep breath. If you did help expose him, then I'm grateful. God, that sounds strange to say, but I mean it. People needed to know what he was. I needed to know. Evan's posture relaxed just a fraction. He didn't confirm or deny anything about his involvement, but he accepted her words with a slight nod. Rachel's eyes brimmed with tears. I was such a fool, Evan. Everything about him, about what I did, was a terrible mistake. I betrayed you, and for what? For a man who turned out to be a liar and a cheat in every possible way. A tear escaped down her cheek. I have been humiliated, yes, but I don't care about the gossip or my reputation. What I hate myself for is how badly I hurt you and Ava. That guilt, it'll never leave me. She wiped her face, steadying her voice. I don't expect you to forgive me. Not at all. But I wanted to tell you face to face that I know I was wrong. So completely wrong. About everything. Evan was quiet for a long moment. His eyes drifted to the window, where the faint outline of the leafless oak tree in their yard was visible against the neighbor's lights. Finally, he spoke, voice low. I appreciate you saying that. You're right. What happened shattered my trust, and it broke something in our marriage that can't be mended. But I forgave you in my own heart some time ago. Rachel looked at him in disbelief. You did? He nodded slowly. For my own sake as much as yours. I realized I couldn't carry that anger forever. It would poison me, and I didn't want to become bitter. You're Ava's mother. I need to be able to treat you with respect and civility, to co-parent. Holding on to hate doesn't help any of us. He paused, a sad smile touching his lips. I won't lie. It still hurts at times. But I don't wake up hating you, Rachel. I mostly feel sad for what we lost. Tears welled again in Rachel's eyes, but they were of relief as much as regret. You have every right to hate me. The fact you don't, that grace is more than I deserve. She took a shaky breath. I know our marriage is over. I know I killed it. I hope that maybe in the future we can be on friendly terms. Not for my sake, but for Ava's. She adores you, and she needs her father. Evan's expression softened at the mention of Ava. She has me, always, he said. Nothing will change that. And yes, we'll remain civil, more than civil. I want to be on good terms. In time, maybe even friends. He managed a faint, kind smile. Rachel gave a small, sad nod. That was more than she had expected. Thank you, she whispered. They talked for over an hour about difficult things and practical things. Rachel informed him she intended to revise the divorce terms to be far more fair and cooperative. She no longer wanted to fight for primary custody or an outsized share of assets. In fact, she insisted on a truly joint custody arrangement, giving Ava equal time with both parents. I was angry and confused when I first filed those papers, she admitted. Colin, even my initial lawyer, They pushed me to go for more, and I listened. But none of that feels right or fair. You're an amazing father, Evan. Ava should be with you as much as with me. Evan looked visibly relieved. The prospect of a protracted custody battle had weighed heavily on him. Hearing Rachel relinquish her earlier demands lifted a burden. I'm glad, he said softly. That means a lot. For Ava's sake and mine. Thank you. She nodded. It's the least I can do after all the damage I've caused. They also spoke about how to handle things moving forward with Ava. They agreed to keep adult details away from her. She was still young enough that the full truth of the affair and even Colin's scandal wouldn't make sense. What she needed to know was simply that Mom and Dad loved her, but wouldn't be together. Eventually, as the clock neared 10, their conversation wound down. Exhaustion and emotional drain were evident on both their faces. But the air between them felt clearer than it had in months. The bitterness and anger had been spoken, heard, and to a degree washed away. Rachel knew this didn't magically fix the past, but it was a step toward a more peaceful future. She realized she was incredibly fortunate that Evan was the man he was, decent, compassionate, and forgiving enough to allow a pathway to amicability. Before she left, Rachel stood by the door and hesitated. Evan, one more thing. He looked at her expectantly. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll fully forgive me in your heart. Not for me, but for you, so you can be happy. Her voice trembled. I also want you to know that I will always care about you. Maybe it's not my place to say now, but I did love you all those years. I lost sight of it, and I'll always regret what I did to that love. But it was real for me. It still is, in a different form. Evan's eyes were gentle, if a bit sad. I loved you too. A part of me always will, as the mother of my child and the woman who shared a decade of my life. But we both have to move on now. She nodded, wiping another tear. You're right. We do. Rachel surprised him then by stepping forward and very lightly embracing him. Evan stiffened only for a second, then allowed it, patting her back in a gesture that felt both kind and formal, like two old friends saying goodbye. When they parted, she managed a slight smile. I am glad you're doing well, Evan. You deserve all the good things that come your way. I truly hope you find happiness with someone who appreciates you fully. The mention of someone hung briefly in the air. It was the closest either had come to acknowledging the possibility of new partners. Rachel had heard a hint, through a mutual acquaintance, that a colleague named Emily had been spending a lot of time with Evan. If so, it was another bitter pill to swallow that he might find with someone else the love she threw away. But rather than jealousy, it stirred an unexpected feeling of relief. Relief that Evan might heal and be cared for. Thank you, Evan replied. I wish the same for you. It might take time, but you can rebuild too. Rachel wasn't sure she deserved happiness beyond her daughter, but she appreciated the sentiment. With that, she gave one last nod and turned to leave. Evan saw her out and gently closed the door behind her. Walking to her car, Rachel felt a strange mix of sorrow and solace. Sorrow for the life that was gone forever, but solace because, at last, she and Evan had reached a place of understanding. He didn't hate her. He was even willing to forgive and treat her kindly, though not as a husband, at least as a fellow parent and someone who had once meant the world to him. That was more than she had any right to expect. Inside the house, Evan stood by the door for a moment, collecting his thoughts. The conversation had been intense, stirring up old feelings and pain, but ultimately, he felt lighter. It was as if a chapter had truly closed. The anger and resentment he held toward Rachel had been heavy to carry, and now he could set it down. He peeked through the curtain to watch her car pull away. She drove off slowly into the winter night, red taillights glowing briefly before turning the corner out of the neighborhood. Evan exhaled, a long plume of breath in the quiet foyer. This was the shifting of tides indeed. Rachel was no longer an enemy or a source of torment. She was a flawed person seeking redemption, and he could empathize with that. He would always keep a guarded part of himself around her. Trust, once shattered, doesn't easily mend. But he saw a path to a cordial, even supportive coexistence. And that was good for everyone, especially Ava. As he turned off the living room lights and headed upstairs, Evan glanced at a small framed photo that still remained on a shelf, Ava's last birthday party. In the picture, Rachel and Evan stood on either side of their daughter, all three smiling as Ava grinned at her cake. It was a beautiful moment in time, frozen in that image. Evan carefully picked up the frame. There was a time when he couldn't look at this photo without a stab of pain, but now he managed a faint smile. It reminded him not just of what was lost, but of what still remained. Their shared love for Ava, and memories that, for all the pain at the end, were real and precious in their time. He set the photo down gently. The tide had indeed shifted. The bitterness of betrayal was receding, and in its wake there was something like hope. Hope that both he and Rachel could find better days ahead, separately, but cooperatively. Evan headed upstairs, feeling more at peace than he had since the nightmare began. He had faced the worst of storms and navigated through. Now calmer waters awaited, and he intended to sail them toward a better horizon. Chapter 7. Building Anew. The year that followed was one of transformation for Evan. With the turmoil of the past behind him, he focused on two things: being the best father he could be to Ava, and rebuilding his professional life on his own terms. For Ava, the changes were handled with as much care and consistency as possible. Evan and Rachel finalized their divorce amicably, and true to her word, Rachel cooperated in a shared custody arrangement. Ava split her time between her parents, and while the first few months were an adjustment, the little girl remained her cheerful, resilient self, buoyed by the love and reassurance both mom and dad gave her. Evan cherished his days with Ava, making her breakfast, walking her to school when it was his turn, reading bedtime stories about brave explorers, her favorites. He even learned to braid her hair for school picture day, a task that took many clumsy attempts and lots of giggling from Ava until he got it right. In those everyday moments, Evan found healing. The simple joy of holding his daughter's hand or watching her conquer the monkey bars on the playground reminded him that life still held goodness and innocence. They created new routines: Friday pizza nights when she was with him, Saturday morning pancakes, a tradition revived, just the two of them now. Ava, in her perceptive but gentle way, occasionally asked questions. "Are you happy, Daddy?" Or, "Do you miss Mommy?" Evan answered truthfully in ways a child could understand. He told her he was happier now that everyone was being honest, and that he and Mommy both loved her very much, even if they lived in different houses. That seemed to satisfy her. She would usually respond with a hug or cuddle, as if sensing that was what he needed. Professionally, the clouds Colin had tried to cast over Evan's career dissipated quickly. Once Colin's misconduct came to light, Evan's own reputation quietly rebounded. Colleagues realized the plagiarism accusation against him had been a baseless ploy, and any lingering doubts vanished. The scholarly community, small as it was, murmured sympathetically about how Evan had been a victim of Colin's machinations, both personally and professionally. Not one to dwell on sympathy, Evan poured his energy into his work. He finished a long-pending research project on early American trade networks, ironically, a field adjacent to Colin's work, but one Evan approached with scrupulous originality. The research was published in a top journal and received positive notice. He made a point in the article's acknowledgments to thank his mentors for instilling in him the values of academic integrity and rigor, an oblique nod to recent events that those in the know did not miss. Then came the offer from Columbia University. Famed for its history department, Columbia had been quietly looking to poach talented mid-career scholars, and Evan's name was floated by a respected colleague. After a series of interviews and a campus visit, they offered him a tenured position with a raise and ample resources. It was a bittersweet decision. Moving states and uprooting life wasn't easy. But after discussing logistics with Rachel, who, much as it hurt her, agreed it was a great opportunity and that they'd make co-parenting work long distance. Evan accepted. By late summer, he found himself in New York City, settling into a modest brownstone apartment on the Upper West Side, not far from campus. Ava would spend summers and holidays with him in the city, and he would travel to Massachusetts at least one weekend a month to spend time with her during the school year. It wasn't an ideal everyday arrangement, but they were committed to making sure Ava felt she had two homes rather than losing one. And New York, with its bright lights and big parks, quickly became a second playground for her during visits. Evan thrived at Columbia. On his first day as a professor there, he walked through the ivy-draped campus with a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a fresh start in every sense. His colleagues in the department welcomed him warmly. If anyone knew of the drama at his previous institution, they either didn't mention it or considered it old news. Here, he was judged on his merits, which were quickly apparent. He dove into teaching with renewed passion. In lectures, he engaged students with vivid tales of history's twists and turns, often weaving in lessons about honesty and perspective. He became known for a particular opening seminar to incoming history majors. He spoke about famous historical hoaxes and frauds, and how the truth, while sometimes delayed, inevitably comes to light. The subtext of his own experience was lost on students, but it gave his words a weight and authenticity even his peers noticed. Professor Taylor really means it when he talks about integrity, one student commented in a course evaluation. It's inspiring. Beyond teaching, Evan took on the role of mentor with gusto. He advised graduate students, taking special care to encourage those who felt marginalized or unsure of themselves. He remembered how Emily Zhao, the colleague he'd spoken to during his investigation, had nearly been derailed by Colin's theft of her ideas. So when one of his own grad students confided fear that a senior scholar might scoop her research, Evan knew how to guide and protect her, ensuring she got proper credit in a collaboration. He soon became a leader in promoting integrity on campus, mentoring younger scholars and championing honesty in research at every opportunity. Away from campus, Evan began to explore the city's rich culture with Ava whenever she visited. He took her to the Natural History Museum, where she marveled at the dinosaur skeletons and insisted he read every plaque aloud. To Central Park's carousel, her shrieks of delight on the spinning horses echoing in his memory, and to little bakeries in his neighborhood to find the best chocolate croissant. He started sending Rachel pictures of Ava's New York adventures, an olive branch and proof that their daughter was thriving. Rachel always responded with gratitude, glad to see Ava smiling and bonding with her dad in new surroundings. As the seasons turned, Evan realized he had found something unexpected in his new life: peace. Not the complacent peace of his old routine, where he'd been oblivious to troubles brewing, but a hard-won, conscious peace. He had faced betrayal, fought back with integrity, and come out the other side stronger and wiser. There was a calm confidence in him now. One crisp autumn afternoon, after finishing a seminar on colonial correspondence, in which he deftly included a segment on famous forged letters and the importance of authenticity, another subtle nod to honesty, Evan strolled across campus with a colleague, Dr. Emily Carter. Emily was a fellow professor who joined Columbia around the same time he did. Over the past months, she'd become a close friend, a bright presence with quick wit and an unwaveringly ethical outlook that matched his own. She taught literature, and their paths often crossed on interdisciplinary panels and at coffee breaks, where they discovered a mutual love for jazz and old libraries. As they walked, Emily Carter teased him lightly about the enthusiastic response his seminar was getting. "You know half the history grad students want to switch advisors to you now, right? You're becoming a bit of a rock star, Taylor." Evan chuckled and shook his head. "Hardly. I just tell them what I wish someone had told me at their age." Emily gave him a warm smile. "Well, it's working. You're making a real impact here." She paused, then added sincerely, "We're lucky to have you." Those words stuck with Evan. Lucky to have you. Not long ago, he had felt like a broken man who'd lost everything that mattered. Now he was valued, respected, and doing what he loved in an environment where he could truly flourish. That evening, Evan returned to his apartment to find Ava's latest artwork in the mail, a messy finger painting titled Me and Daddy at the Zoo, and a friendly voicemail from Rachel sharing a cute story about Ava losing her first tooth. Life wasn't perfect. There were still pangs of guilt on occasion and the loneliness of an empty apartment on certain nights, but it was undeniably good. He put Ava's painting on his fridge with a magnet and made himself a simple dinner. As he ate, he mentally ran through plans for an upcoming academic conference where he'd been invited to speak on a panel about ethical challenges in historical research. The irony of that was not lost on him, and he accepted the invitation with a quiet sense of purpose. If sharing his hard-earned lessons could help prevent even one unethical act or give one struggling scholar the courage to speak up, it would be worth it. In the quiet of his apartment, the city humming softly outside, Evan realized that for the first time in a long while, he was looking forward to the future. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer ached every day. More and more, they felt like sources of strength, reminders of what he'd overcome. He had built something new from the ruins, a life where his principles, his love for his child, and his dedication to truth guided him forward. It was a life he could be proud of, and one that set an example for those around him. And as fate would have it, this life was about to offer even more happiness than he thought he deserved. Chapter 8. Finding Peace and Closure. Spring eased into summer, and with it came new blossoms in Evan's life, both literal and metaphorical. In the community garden near his apartment, tulips and daffodils poked up through the soil, brightening Evan's morning walks. And in his heart, something new and beautiful was blooming as well. Love, genuine and steady, with someone who had quietly become his closest companion. It happened naturally. Evan and Dr. Emily Carter's friendship deepened over shared projects and long conversations after faculty meetings. Emily brought out the best in those around her. She listened with empathy, laughed easily, and could make even a mundane coffee break feel special. Over time, those coffee breaks turned into intentional lunches, then occasional dinners. They talked about everything: her love of Victorian novels, his favorite jazz records, her childhood in Vermont, his adventures raising Ava. One evening, after a faculty reception where they'd both snuck out early to grab burgers from a food truck, Evan found himself telling Emily the whole story of what he'd been through. He hadn't planned to. It just spilled out as they sat on a bench overlooking the Hudson River, the city lights reflecting on the water. He spoke of Rachel's affair, the pain and anger, the quiet revenge he'd orchestrated, and the way life had changed. Emily listened without judgment, her hand finding his halfway through and giving a reassuring squeeze at the hardest parts. When he finished, he felt oddly lighter, as if speaking it aloud to her loosened the last hold of those ghosts. Emily's eyes glistened as she looked at him. "You've been through a lot," she said softly. "More than anyone should. I'm so sorry you were hurt like that." He squeezed her hand back. "It was a nightmare," he admitted, "but it taught me a lot about myself. And it brought me here." He gestured vaguely, meaning not just the physical place, but the emotional space he was in, with her. Emily seemed to understand. She gave him a gentle smile. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here, Evan." Under the glow of a nearby street lamp, with the warm night air carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers, Evan leaned in and kissed her. It was tender, tentative, his heart thumping with the vulnerability of caring again. Emily kissed him back without hesitation. In that moment, Evan felt something he hadn't in a long time: pure, unshadowed happiness. From that night on, their relationship grew quickly and surely. There were no secret games or uneasy feelings. Loving Emily was entirely different from what he'd experienced in those last years with Rachel. With Emily, everything was out in the open and honest. She valued loyalty and transparency as deeply as he did. In fact, she often said those were the qualities she admired most in him, after seeing his integrity in action at the university. Over the months that followed, Emily became a beloved part of Evan's world. She didn't try to erase or replace the past. Rather, she helped him make sense of it and move beyond it. Importantly, she embraced Ava's presence in his life wholeheartedly. The first time Emily met Ava was during a summer weekend in New York. Evan was nervous. Ava had seen him and Emily together on campus a couple of times, but this was the first intentional introduction. They arranged a picnic in Central Park. Emily arrived with a basket of sandwiches and, to Ava's delight, a box of homemade chocolate chip cookies. The connection was immediate. Emily had a warm, playful manner that put Ava at ease. They kicked a soccer ball around, watched a street performer making giant soap bubbles, and Emily patiently let Ava show off every single trick she'd learned on the playground monkey bars. That evening, after tucking Ava into bed, tired out from the day's adventures, Evan and Emily sat on the couch, shoulders touching. He thanked her for being so wonderful with his daughter. Emily just curled up next to him and said, "She's a great kid, Evan. You're a great dad. It's easy to see why she's so special." It was in that moment that Evan realized he was deeply, irretrievably in love with Emily Carter. When summer ended and Ava returned to Boston for the school year, Emily often traveled with Evan to visit her. This introduced a delicate new dynamic. Sometimes Rachel would see Emily at pickups or drop-offs. Those encounters, while brief, remained civil. Rachel was polite, if a bit reserved, toward Emily, and Emily, understanding the sensitivity, was gracious in return. On one trip, when Emily couldn't join, and it was just Evan bringing Ava back to Massachusetts, Rachel gently inquired about her. "How's Emily?" she asked as they stood on her porch, watching Ava play with chalk on the driveway. There was no malice or envy in her tone, only genuine curiosity and perhaps a touch of wistfulness. "She's doing well," Evan answered with a small smile. "She's incredible with Ava. They get along great." Rachel nodded, absorbing that. "I'm glad," she said quietly, and she truly meant it. It stung to know another woman was by Evan's side, but if anyone deserved happiness, it was him. Meanwhile, Rachel herself was rebuilding in her own way. She had taken a job at a nonprofit in Boston that focused on children's education, channeling her energy into something positive. She mostly stayed out of the social scene, preferring time with Ava or with a few close friends. She told Evan in one of their periodic co-parenting phone calls that she wasn't interested in dating. She needed to work on herself to make sure she never repeated her past mistakes. He understood and wished her well. As the following spring arrived, Evan realized he had reached a place of contentment that once seemed unimaginable. One sunny weekend, he and Emily decided to take Ava apple-picking upstate. To their pleasant surprise, Rachel accepted their invitation to join, at Ava's insistence. "Mommy loves apples too." Rachel was understandably hesitant, worried she'd feel like a third wheel or that it would be awkward, but in the spirit of cooperation for their daughter, she agreed. That day, strolling through the orchard rows with baskets in hand turned out to be lovely. Ava darted between trees, trying to reach the highest, reddest apples. Emily lifted her a couple of times to help her grab one just out of reach. Rachel and Evan found themselves reminiscing quietly about a long-ago visit to a similar farm when Ava was a toddler. The pain such memories once evoked had dulled to a gentle nostalgia for both of them. They all sat together at a picnic bench afterward, sipping warm cider. Ava munched on a cider donut, sugar dusting her chin and making everyone laugh. For that moment, to any outside observer, they might have looked like an unusual but happy family. In a sense, they were exactly that. Not traditional, but bound by affection for Ava and a hard-won mutual respect. Driving back to the city that evening, Ava dozed in the back seat amid a heap of apples and pumpkins they'd picked up. Emily rested her head on Evan's shoulder as he drove, the comfortable silence wrapping around them. Evan felt a profound sense of closure. He reached over and intertwined his fingers with Emily's, and she gave him a warm, knowing smile. In that quiet moment, he he realized he had everything he truly needed. The anger and betrayal of the past had been replaced by trust and love. The family he now had, different in form but no less real, was living proof of resilience and the power of forgiveness. He had not only survived the storm that once threatened to destroy him, he had emerged from it stronger and wiser. Integrity, honesty, and compassion had guided him through the darkest of times, and now they lit the path forward. Justice had been served, wounds had healed, and love, steadfast and true, had found him again. Watching the city lights dancing on the horizon, with Emily by his side and Ava safe and happy, Evan Taylor felt a swell of gratitude. He had learned that even after the gravest of betrayals, life could offer renewal. And as he headed toward whatever tomorrow might bring, he did so with a hopeful heart, at peace at last.